guess it's week 5 here on our summer Sunday school, our hot topic, of course, one of the hot topics of our day, gender and sexuality. And we're coming here, we've kind of concluded the last 3 weeks our study on the image of God, on the doctrine of humanity from the Bible. We've looked at what does it mean that we're made in God's image and likeness. We've looked at the effects of the fall, the corruption that remains within, our desires, temptation. We've looked at the internal part of our makeup. We've looked last week, you recall, we had a bit of a roller coaster ride through the Bible and saw the relationship between man and woman as deeply embedded in far more than mud flaps and dresses, far greater and far deeper than anything that our culture and sadly the church often settles for. We settle for surface level conversations about gender, and it's no surprise then that folks don't listen. Why would I want to listen if all it means to be a man is that I like power tools or whatever the case may be? That's not attractive enough. The Bible, we saw, pictures something far greater. The man as the high priest, the woman representing the tabernacle of God as Christ himself loves his church in the same way as the bride. So today we turn from the Bible to do what needs to be done. You and I need the work we're going to do here over the next 3 weeks, which is a work of history. We move from 3 weeks on the biblical doctrine of humanity to 3 weeks on how do we get here? How have we gotten to a point where in the last 2 years, the last 10 years, the last 50 years, everything changes so rapidly. There's no consensus on what it means to be a human person anymore. There's no consensus on gender. How have we gotten to this point? And, well, people make a lot of money telling you their secret tips on how we got to this point. But I think far few do careful scholarship and examination of what are the real reasons as to why we got here. So the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at that. And today we're going to come to what I've titled, not original to me, the first sexual revolution. I don't think any of us really heard about the first sexual revolution. It's a period in time we're ignorant of. But I'm going to pray in a second, and then we're going to go back to the last time really that you have a pre-Christian empire fully in 200, 300 years transformed by Christianity. It's one of the great questions that every rational person must answer, every thinking person must answer. How was the Roman Empire at its height, at the peak of history, how did it change in 200, 300 years from a pagan worldview to a Christian empire? How did it change? There was no, Islamic conquest, right? Islam came with the sword, you may know, other things as well. But how did Christianity do it? There was no great battle. There was no great Christian army that won the day. How did it do? We're going to look here particularly at the question of sex. So let me remind you again, this is an adult Sunday school class, and so parents, you need to make the choices as you have about what's best in communicating these truths, these realities that we need to know as Christians. We need to be equipped. You need to make those choices for your own families. But let me go ahead and pray for us, and then we'll get into it. You have your outline there. If you need extra copies, just let me know, and I'll delegate somebody to go make copies. But let me pray, and then we can get into it. O Lord our God, you are the God of ages past. You're the God of the present. You're the Lord of future to come, because you are eternal. You are unchanging. And yet you have so governed history. You have so shown us the way in which your saving love, the way in which your care for all people should change how we treat others, how we treat those who are marginalized, those who are weak, those who don't have the power or the status, the rank. Show us, Lord, the way Christ changes lives and the way he changes society. We pray this in his name. Amen. Well, we begin here. We begin really with the question of the modern story about sex. There's a modern story about sex today. That's very common. You probably believe it in some part because it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Here's the story. Here's the history of sexuality that frames so many of our neighbors' responses. When you say, well, no, you need to be in a one man, one woman, one flesh union for one life, right? All of life, monogamy, right? People say, come on now. I don't care how many Bible verses you quote at me. It doesn't make sense. Why does it not make sense? So here's the story. Here's the version of the story. First, you begin with pre-Christian societies, whether in pagan Rome, whether in Greece, whether in China, India, Mesoamerica. You look at pre-Christian cultures, and the story goes, well, these cultures were free. You look at the Roman Empire. There's diversity. There's pleasure on every corner. They understood the freedom that authentic love, that pleasure can bring. The Greeks and the Romans realized something that we have had repressed for many years, for centuries. They realized that life's really all about what you can get out of it. You know, that in wine there is truth, right? In vino veritas. That in drink and in women and in pleasure, in food, decadence. That is the way of living. That's the way to find true pleasure. But then those evil Catholics came in. Then those evil Puritans, whatever your flavor you prefer. Then the evil Christians, those Jewish Christians, the Judeo-Christian cultures, they oppressed everything that makes us free and real. They oppressed pleasure. They're anti-pleasure. You know those Puritans. You've read Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. You know, right? There's this popular conception that, suddenly Christianity comes in and you're starting to legalize morality. You're starting to surround it with all sorts of taboos. It becomes Victorian in essence. They become prudes, those Christians, and they want to force their beliefs on everybody else. And so you forbid sex outside of marriage because that keeps women down. That's the way the Christians work. They control women. They help men protect their daughters and their wives as their own property, and they keep you feeling guilty. They keep you feeling shameful and guilty about things that are just bodily, scientific experiences, right? This is the story that we buy into. This is the story that your neighbors buy into. Because finally now in the 20th century, or whatever century you want to go back to, usually the 20th century, right? In modern times, as modern people, we have progressed. We are on the path upwards. We've come to realize that all people have rights, that all people have freedom, and we have the right to love whoever we choose. Love is love. I can choose whom I want to love, as long as there's consent, and that's fine for me. Science has shown us that love, that pleasure and sex is a healthy thing. It's important to find out who you are. And it's a human right. And so we're only going to flourish as humans, as people, if the right to choose is equally available to everybody. Everybody needs to be able to have the right to choose whoever they want to do whatever they want to with them, as long as they want to, and not any further, not any longer. And that's a very persuasive argument for a lot of folks because it's all about you in part, right? Now, we're going to get into the critiques of this, but we have to realize that some of what this modern story is actually true. That we are called to be free people in a manner of speaking. But you have to understand the power of this narrative and not just say, well, that's wrong. That's not the Bible. It's not Christian. Oh, okay. Okay, so what? You're not going to persuade people. You're not going to actually, until you understand the modern story about sex, you're not going to actually be able to understand how Christian it is. You're not going to be able to understand how it draws deeply on the wells of Christianity and twists it, subverts it. Right? You're not until you understand the first sexual revolution, you will not have the resources to go beyond a proof text Christianity. And so many of our neighbors need much more. You and I need much more in the church. We need more than a proof text Christianity, simply saying, well, here's what the Bible says, do it. And how does it work in your life? How does that work with your own sins, your own struggles? Try telling your kids, just stop it and see how far that gets you over the years. No, you want to change their hearts, right? How do you think to change our neighbors' hearts? We have to understand the story. We have to puncture the caricature. This is a caricature. It is not a right history, but what is the right history? Let's get into it, okay? Any questions so far? Okay, we have a lot to cover, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on questions right now. Remember, last week of our class, week 12, all your questions and answers I expect to flow forth from your little mouths, big mouths, whatever they are, right? You can text, you can email, you can whatever you want to me, and we'll cover it. You can even raise your hand on that week 12 and shock me, stump me, surprise me. But Roman views, right? So that's the modern history of sex. Now we get into, what did the Romans say? Now remember, why are we going to the Romans? We're going to the Roman Empire not because in the 21st century we're like Rome. There's some partial truth to that. But we're going there because it's the last pre-Christian empire, pre-Christian society that we can observe in 300 years transformed. So what was it like? What was it like before Christianity? Well, so the purpose of gender, the purpose of man and woman, the purpose of marriage, the purpose of sex was designed to keep Rome safe. The goal was, you might say, a nationalistic, or you might say a social goal. Everything centered around the polis. That's a Greek word, I know, but still, it's the patria, if you want the Latin version, right? The fatherland. You must keep the fatherland well ordered. You must keep Rome pure. How do you keep Rome successful? How do you keep the empire safe and happy? You have traditional marriage. You have traditional marriage between one man and one woman to bear more Roman babies. You want more Roman sons who are noble. You want more Roman daughters who can make more Roman babies. Because Romans are better than those barbarians. Romans have been given the vision of the gods, right? Rome was founded, as the propaganda story goes, right? The Aeneid, if you read it ever, fun little story. Rome was founded, right, with the great man Aeneas, the great hero that was founded by a she-god, by a goddess. So it had a divine purpose. And you don't want to hurt Rome, do you? Look at the great empire. Look at what we've done. So the purpose is to guard the exceptional, special Roman society. So the Roman family must be kept pure and well-ordered so the empire would be pure and well-ordered and healthy. Good family, you have enough good families, you're going to have a good government. Enough traditional families, you're going to have a traditional government. That sound a little familiar to you at least? Okay. So the man. What's the ideal Roman man? And when we're speaking here, we're speaking generally about free Roman men. That means we're speaking here about free, generally noble or upper class men. Because real Romans, even until the day of Paul, right? Paul is special. Paul is special because he is a Roman citizen. It was supremely uncommon in the first century for anyone who was not Roman or Italian to be a Roman citizen. They speculate Paul's dad fought pirates for Pompey. He got citizenship as a reward, and so Paul got that as his kid. It was very unique. That's why they're flogging him, and nobody thinks about it until he says it, because they don't assume that a Jew would ever do that, would ever have citizenship. Because Romans were free men. That was the difference. They were slaves to nobody. They valued freedom. And the man, the noble man, the ideal Roman man, had Roman piety, pietas. He was devoted to Rome. He was devoted to his family. But the dark side, of course, is he was also devoted to his pleasure, to his lust. So the ideal Roman man was an honorable and devoted husband and father, noble in all ways, outwardly, socially acceptable. You would have loved him. You would have loved the ideal Roman man. And yet, it was assumed that every Roman male would be filled with passions and lust, which could be sated and satisfied with slaves, prostitutes, poor women, boys. I mentioned there in the footnote, even the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, that the politicians love to quote today on Twitter because he's stoic and he don't give in to his pleasures. Well, actually, he did. Because the assumption was that the male body, when it reached puberty, would be kind of in, the the passions would begin to flow. They thought there were literal kind of like passions in your bloodlines that would flow in your body. And you couldn't resist it. It just happened. Medically speaking, this is what they argued. Don't repress it. It has to happen. Just let them loose. So from about 14, 15, 16 until about 20, ideally about 20, you're just gonna let loose. It's gonna happen. You can't control it, right? It's just gonna happen. That's why many Roman men, many again upper class men, married later in their late 20s when they developed self-control. Right, the ideal Roman man was a self-controlled man who had mastered that passions. But if he had a oopsie every once in a while, hey, he's a guy. I mean, that's just gonna happen, right? I think I have a quote there by Plutarch somewhere here. Yes, it's under the woman, right? Plutarch gives this advice to wives. If your husband makes some little slip with a slave girl or hired lady, do not bear it too gravely and consider that he wishes to spare you from his debauchery, right? Well, they're going to make little oopsies. They're going to have little slips. They're guys. That's what guys do. But just make sure that outwardly you remain noble and pure. It's okay if they do this with slaves or prostitutes, because why? Sex is about power. It's about status. It's about age. Men were able to force themselves on anybody they wanted to, except another wife of another man of status. In fact, Caesar Augustus famously instituted a law that was harsher than anything in Puritan New England, harsh on adultery, because adultery was the cardinal sin in Rome. You should not commit adultery, because that would ruin the pure Roman family. The Roman family has to remain pure. One husband, one wife. Now you could divorce the wife pretty easily. You can marry for convenience, for politics, but you shouldn't, if somebody's a wife, you shouldn't commit adultery, because that would break the social contract. That would break the social fabric of Rome. You begin to see there's some issues here, right? So I mentioned that they're the story of Cato the Elder. If you know anything about Roman history, you know a little bit about Cato the Elder. He was a Roman, mighty consul, censor, mighty Roman man. He's the Abe Lincoln of Rome, the George Washington, whoever you like. I don't know, he's an ideal Roman guy, ideal American guy. That's Cato. And there's one time in his life where he sees a young buddy, a young son of one of his friends, go out of a brothel. He says, "Good job, man. Hey, you've done well, because you've avoided free women. You've avoided other men's wives. You've used what's provided for you." That's what they're there for. That's what those women are there for. They're used so you can get what you need out of life. It's a very permissive sexual ethic. The footnote there identifies the Jewish philosopher Philo. Says, well, the Jews are different. We live according to a special custom. But among other people, young men after their 14th year can use with shamelessness all sorts of women, right? There's this complete permissive sexual ethic, while on the outside, it looks traditional, right? On the outside, it looks very proper, because the ideal Roman woman, if the ideal Roman man was a noble man devoted to his wife, devoted to his family, the ideal Roman woman was a modest and chaste woman. The quality there in the Latin, for those who are nerds, pudicitia. We say today sometimes a little bit. We call somebody impudent. And nobody really knows what that means, right? But we use it, for being funny. Oh, you impudent little scum, right? It means, in essence, immodest, right? You were not modest. And so the ideal Roman woman was a chaste and modest woman. She must not be immodest. She must not be impudent. Why? Because Rome would fall. Do you want the nation to fall? Do you want this land that the gods have given to us to fall? No. So you must make sure, if you're an upper-class Roman woman, that you are outwardly monogamous, that you're faithful to your husband, that you're chaste before marriage. This is why girls are married early in Rome. Often, if you're poorer the teen years. Upper-class daughters could wait until they're about 20 years old. But this creates, if you can imagine, an age gap. Men traditionally married older, that they were older, and they married younger wives. And this creates a hierarchy where there's a double standard because the men can indulge themselves. The women generally are expected not to, though as time goes on, the elite women could be like the men and grab a slave here or there for what you wish to. They could do that because slaves did not have a conscience in the Roman view. Slaves were not people. Slavery was a huge business, a booming industry. It really ran the Roman economy. But they were not seen as people. They did not have a conscience. And so therefore, if you had a dalliance with them, you would not be immodest. Women or men. You would not ruin Roman society because they don't actually affect Roman society. They don't actually do anything because they're not really people. So you can treat them as horribly as you want to, and still Rome will be upheld and honored. And so the purpose here of this woman is not to find pleasure in marriage. Is not really seen as pleasure. I mean, there's some writing in the poets about, you have romantic love. It's ideal if you can get that. That's great. But in the Roman mindset, marriage is not about pleasure. That's a very modern concept. It's not about finding your one true soulmate. It's about kids. It's reproductive in nature. That's why Augustus famously, second famous law he creates, the Jus Trium Liberorum, which is the law that gave women the right, the freedom to conduct business on their own if she had given birth to 3 children. Hugely popular because women in Roman culture were actually under the authority of their father until he died. So if you're married, you're not under your husband's authority, you're under your father's authority. Unless you have 3 kids. Right? And that meant that marriages in the upper classes, you get married, you have a baby, divorce. Marry somebody else. Because your dad wants to make good political alliances. He wants to use you, right, as an object. You can see how this is horrible. I mean, you can see how this is pre-Christian in many ways. There's this marriage market that develops. And so the sum of this all, you have a double standard. Universal hypocrisy, universal double standard that emerges. Right? The men who have the power, who have the age, who have the rank, they can do what they want. And they're even expected. If you don't, you're weird. Right? If you don't indulge yourself, you're seen as strange. That's what the Jews do, and they're weird. But the women are expected to be, chaste and modest. Occasionally they can have maybe a dalliance here or there, but it shouldn't be the norm. Any questions before we get to a little bit of the dark side here that I've only alluded to? Comparatively, yeah. Remember, slaves are not people. So they don't have a conscience, so it's not adultery with them. Yeah, same. I mean, often, yeah. And there's this, not to get too much into it, but we have a skeleton. There's an archaeological dig, I want to say North Africa somewhere, where there's a skeleton of a young girl in her teens, and there's a little slave collar around her, and all you have is the collar and the body, and there's a little engraving on the collar, and it says, I'm a prostitute, I ran away. Kind of identifying this is a slave whose use is primarily for the pleasure of other people, right? And that's really the dark side of things. The dark side is we've only talked about free Rome, right? Upper class Romans. What about everybody else? This is not the majority of people, right? Most folks were not this. This was the elites. The cultural elites could do what they wanted to. They could look good on the outside and then indulge themselves, right? Yes, Millie. Yes, correct. Yeah, that would not. Yes, if they're upper class, because you wouldn't want. I mean, if you did that, that would cause political problems for you. You could take a slave. Slave girls were there for that. That's why they're there, right? They're there for you to use as a safety valve, right? I mean, that's the way it's kind of put in the literature. Yes, Greg. Yes, and so yes, and that's the way it worked. Divorce was fairly easy for men, women, sorry, but it was very easy for the guys. So the dark side of all this is the complete evil that was the Roman slave trade and the Roman prostitution trade. It was, as I quote here, a lot of this is from Kyla Harper's great book in the last, I think, 2015 maybe, 2013. I mentioned it there, From Shame to Sin. It's an academic book, so I don't recommend it to everybody. But if you're a nerd, you can read through it. It's revolutionary. It's been really good to puncture the narrative that we have of this ideal Roman lifestyle. It's not ideal, right? You can tell. Women are half the slave population. They bore the brunt of abuse without legal protection, social protection. They are devastatingly vulnerable. It normalized abuse. It normalized rampant evil. And so this is really the dark side of everything. I mentioned there the footnote, sex was cheap from the prostitutes, about the price of the loaf of bread, and the reason why the upper class folks didn't really want to go to the prostitutes is because that's where everybody went there. That's where the slaves went. That's where everybody went. You don't want to dirty yourself. You're rich. You have servants for this purpose. But it was, as you can tell, horrible. So, any other questions before we move on to what Christianity does with this? Christianity, this is the world Christianity came into. What is Christianity? Any questions before we, any other questions? Philip, yes, sir.
They send the soldiers in and conquer the city. They take all the people inside the city that left alive, so all the women in the back, defend the city, probably. They take all the women, children, old men, ship them off to Rome, pay for the soldiers who would then go on to conquer another city, and that was how they get their conquest.
That's one way. Right, Philip's talking about the one way Rome expanded her control and got all its money and all these slaves was through conquest and through taking folks. The issue, of course, occurs about this time period with Augustus. One of the reasons why he's doing all this legal stuff is that the empire is kind of almost reached its max. Not quite, of course. There's going to be conquest under Trajan in the east, but it's pretty big. There's not much else you can't get a lot of slaves that way through conquest. So what do? Well, those slaves you got earlier have babies. And so guess what? Those babies are slaves too. And so they're raised from birth to be put into this kind of environment. It's horrible. It's but so you would have the kind of reproduction of slaves. You needed them to have children to keep the money rolling, right? It's all about the money. It's all about capitalism. I mean, that's an anachronistic thing, but it's all about the economy, right? It's the economy. In fact, you see the same thing, don't you, with Wilberforce and the abolition of the British slave. If you know anything about Wilberforce and the abolition of the British slave trade, much of the impetus behind keeping it was economic. Right? You want to keep the money flowing from the plantations in the Caribbean. You want to attack money? No. We got to have food on the table. So Christianity comes into this. Great questions, by the way. Christianity comes into this, and you really have to ask the question: how did a more restrictive view of sexual behavior emerge as the voluntary choice, not coerced, the voluntary choice for millions of people in just 300 years? I mentioned there. It's only in the year 438. That's a long time. 100 years after Constantine the Great. Only in the year 438 is prostitution made illegal under the Emperor Theodosius. So it's not as if Christianity, one argument, of course, is, well, Christianity comes in and they restrict sexuality, they repress it, and they just force themselves as a power play on everybody else. That's not what happened, though. That's not the actual story. It took 450 years, virtually after Christ, for anything like that to happen. And of course, as you know, that law, it may have made it illegal, but it didn't tamp it out immediately, right? And So how did this restrictive view, this Christian sexual revolution occur? It's a very vital question of history. How did it happen? Well, I mentioned here one thing you hopefully have realized by now, that while the pagan code of conduct was more free for men, certain men, upper class men, the Christian view of sex was vastly more positive, vastly more humane, and actually far more beautiful. And I mentioned here that every culture, our culture, has a morality around what kind of sex is good, what kind is bad. And it's always, every culture believes something about the purpose of sex. What's it for? What's its goal? What's its purpose? Well, if you're achieving the purpose, right, for Rome, it's this nationalistic, this social union, and it's the freedom for men just to have their pleasure when they're younger, particularly. Well, in Rome, we see here that morality around sex is determined by social status. It's by position. It's by power. It's by age. It's for personal pleasure or social enjoyment. Those who had more honor, those who were of higher rank, were more free. It's all about power, which, by the way, it should resonate very strongly. If you're looking for an apologetic or evangelistic thing to say, I'm going to cut to the chase here for a second. We live in a world today where people are saying everything's about power. So tell your neighbors, you want to look at what happens when a society is all about power? Look to Rome and see what that does. When you base your social norms on power plays, it ruins things. Right? But so Christianity here is the first sexual revolution in the world. It changes completely. Nothing was like it before. It changes the place of sex from the city, right, from a nationalistic or a social thing, have good sex to save Rome, right, to save the country, to make Rome great again, right? It changes it from the city, the polis, the patria, to the cosmos. This is very important to realize. Suddenly, with Christianity, you are connected not to a land or a country. You're connected to God's order. You're connected to the world that God has made. Sex is no longer judged by how it helps keep Rome good. It's judged, how does it fall in line with the great pattern of God's grace and of God's creation? Now, let me make a very critical point here. One misstep that many Christians make is that we actually say, no, the shift was from the nation to the internal soul, right? The issue, the caricature, this is the caricature, right? The caricature of the Christian Revolution is Rome was about this, and then Christians internalized it. They repressed it. They said, keep it all inside. Sex is a metaphor for the soul's growth. There's a very great danger with that, to say that, that it's all about you yourself being a good little boy or girl and just tamping it down. And that's, unfortunately, you look at me in the conversation today about modesty and purity, many of them have this revolution, the background. They neglect the fact that the Christian understanding of sex is not simply for you yourself. I need to be holy because I need to be holy, or I need to keep myself pure for my own self's sake. But it's actually patterned after God himself, right? God's vision of the world, not just of you yourself, little individual, right? I mentioned there, right, the pattern of God is that he gives himself to us, right? Self-giving, self-sacrifice, giving up, not because pleasure's bad, that's the caricature, but giving up because self-sacrificial love is the best kind of love out there. It gives you actually the most pleasure to enjoy God when you give yourself for another person. So therefore, sex is to be practiced only within this covenant, this lifelong covenant of marriage, because it's not judged by power anymore. It's not high to low, rich to poor, man to woman, but it's by covenantal love. It's by gender difference. That's why Paul's statement in Romans 1 is so revolutionary. A Roman could not have written Romans 1, where Paul says that these actions, God gave them over to their passions to do what was not natural. Men with men and women likewise with women. That was a gender-based understanding of sex. And it was not Roman, right? The Roman basis is, well, men have the power, right? It's not about gender, it's about power. And so Paul actually says, no, because I know that God makes humans, male and female, beautiful in both masculinity and femininity. Therefore, we ought not to do what is against God's pattern. It's not about power. It's about gender. It's about gender difference. It's about the binary of gender. And instantly, what attracted people? It attracted the people who were vulnerable. They're protected from exploitation. No man, no Christian could demand sex from his slaves. No Christian could demand sex from a woman. More than that, of course, sex is no longer seen as an appetite that you kind of just indulge, you kind of give in to. You moderate it as you get older because you don't want to be a glutton, you don't want to be a drunkard, you don't want to be too much in pleasure. You got to have a moderate amount, a dalliance here or there. That's not the Christian idea. The Christian idea of sex is not something you can kind of barely tamp down, but a joyous, even sacred expression that reflects the way God is saving the world. When you give yourself to someone who's like you but different from you, that pattern, even as we saw last week, right? That's the pattern of Revelation 22. The last picture of the church in the Bible is a bride, a New Jerusalem, a city, a mother adorned for her husband, right? Because Christ has given himself, that this temple that is the church, you and I, the temple of God, are made glorious and beautiful, just as men and women give themselves one another in that one flesh union. And so sex is not seen as simply an appetite or a need or a desire. It is put into this worldview, you might say, to help you out, this cosmos, this worldview of grace, this worldview of giving, not of taking, not of grabbing what I can for my own advantage. Radically different. So, summary here, page 3, a couple of things. First, recognize the humanitarian values of our culture, the way we affirm sex, the way we want, the way we talk about it, the way we affirm consent, the way we value. Well, you must consent. You have agency. That's a Christian understanding. Without Christ, you wouldn't have that. Without Christ, you would be the powerful dominate, men or women or rich or whoever. Without Christianity, you would not have the Me Too movement. You would not have this focus. The modern emphasis, furthermore, second, the modern emphasis on the goodness of the body, the modern emphasis on mutual affection and enjoyment, that comes from Christianity. It's not just about me getting what I want out of a relationship. And so when you call out a double standard for locker room talk, you don't let boys be boys. When you call out that double standard, that's actually a Christian gift. That's a gift that Christianity gives to the world. I quote Harper there at the bottom. Amazing quote, academic quote, but I'll read it for you. The social assumptions of pre-Christian sexual morality, such as the casual exploitation of the bodies of powerless non-people, non-persons, seem incomprehensible to us today because the Christian revolution so completely swept away that old order. In other words, what he's saying is, all of this seems wacky and evil to you, not just because you're in church, but because everybody today can't even fathom this, because Christianity was so successful. It so transformed the Roman world. It so changed things. It swept away that old order. So finally, I'll conclude with this second point, bullet point here. The modern story of sexual liberation is old school. It's dull. It's retrograde. And you need to see that. You need to realize that the modern story, this narrative that I started off with, is very dull. It's very old school. It's not progressive. It's not this liberating, amazing thing. It's building upon similar but different, right? Everybody wants to say, well, Rome's just like today. Well, hold back on that one. That's A, bad history, anachronistic, and B, it's not quite correct. There's similarity but difference. A similar thing is that today we want to break that link between sex and the cosmos. We want to break that link between pleasure and God. We want to break it, right? Rather, the difference today is that sex is not about society. Nobody thinks that if you have appropriate pleasure that you're going to save America. Nobody thinks that today. At least I thought that, church. Rather, today, it's about us getting our pleasure, right? It's no longer about men, but now both men and women, right, get pleasure for themselves. It's not quite as brutal yet as Rome, but we're sadly getting there because there remains a Christian residue. But culture today is as objectifying. It's depersonalizing people. It's using people. In ancient Rome, right, the person who has the power gets the pleasure. But today, we have progressed, right? We are progressive in this sense, I suppose, that now both people use each other to get pleasure for themselves, as long as they want to, as long as their own needs are met. If that's the advance we have on Rome in our day. So we have time maybe for one or two comments, questions, pushback, anything you want to add or elaborate upon. I hope you see how vital this is, by the way, to understand our world, to understand the way Christianity has this unique and vital role. And I hope it helps you to actually articulate your belief in Christ in a way that's going to have resonance with people who are concerned. I mean, you give some of this talk to people in the world, your neighbors, and they'll say that's evil. You should say, yes, it is. Right? But why is it evil? And what has replaced it? What are we doing today that's better? So I'll pause again. Questions? The great question, Joshua. The question is, in the Roman worldview, would they like homosexuality? So it's a bit of a difficult question. Let me give you two things, and maybe I'll answer it the last week some more as well. First, it would be homosexuality was okay if you were the active partner, right? The worst thing for a Roman man was to be seen as a girl. And the way, I don't want to get into, I'm trying to be appropriate here. You were supposed to be the active partner in intercourse, not the passive partner. The passive partner was the effeminate partner, and no good Roman man would be passive. You got to be a man's man, right? They would use all sorts of people. They would use boys. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but that's the way the text, I mentioned that before. So that they would have no problem with it as long as you're active. I don't want to go into more detail because I want to be considerate of your, yeah. Yes, there you go, Alexis. Very, very good summary. Any other questions? Yes, Amelia. One last question. Okay. No, well, so it's a good question. The question is, what about women? It was much less talked about. From time to time, of course, it was mentioned. It was alluded to more. That might be the case, yes. And the women, the ideal Roman woman in that situation, I mean, not ideal, but the Roman woman, if they had to be in that situation, it would be better for them to be, again, more active than passive. I don't want to get into more details than that. I want to be careful about our time, but a good question as well. Maybe we can come back to that one at the end of our time. Well, if you have more questions, of course, follow up with me. And Jim, why don't you go? Or with or your parents for those who are not yet adults. Jim, why don't you go ahead and close us in prayer? Amen. Thank you all.